They tore him into pieces to silence a rebellion, but what they built instead was a myth that would shatter an empire. London, 1305. Above the Grey River, a single head watches the city that murdered it. Tar drips down the spike where it's mounted, the blackened face turned toward the sky. To some it is a warning, to others a promise. The wind off the Thames carries the smell of rot and iron, and every traveler who passes beneath that bridge asks the same question: what kind of king needs to kill a man this way? Today you'll hear the story that England tried to bury, not the romantic legend, not the clean, noble ending that Hollywood loves, but the raw truth drawn from the chronicles written by those who stood in the crowd. This is history verified through the very documents that condemned him. We will uncover 3 moments that changed the course of power itself. First, the quiet betrayal that sold a hero for silver. Second, the trial that was never meant to find justice. And third, the execution so calculated in cruelty that it turned fear into rebellion. Each moment will strip away the myth and show how authority, when terrified, reveals its truest face. Because sometimes the louder a ruler proclaims order, the more chaos hides beneath his crown. This is not just the story of a death. It is the anatomy of control, of how a single execution could ignite the fire of a nation. But before we reach the scaffold, we must understand the world that created it. The 2 kingdoms locked in a war of pride and survival, and why Edward Longshanks needed William Wallace alive before he wanted him dead. 1300 AD, an age when fear itself was currency, and a king's shadow could swallow whole nations. When one realm's terror became another realm's reason to exist. By the late 1290s, Britain was a powder keg. King Edward I of England, the man history calls Longshanks, had already carved his legend into the map. He had crushed Wales, built castles like stone claws gripping its hills, and made sure that every generation after him would remember who ruled the Isles. But to a man like Edward, victory was never enough. He needed obedience. He needed witnesses to submission. Across the northern border lay Scotland, fractured, leaderless, and wounded. When King Alexander III fell from his horse in 1286, leaving no direct heir, the Scottish throne became a chessboard. 13 nobles claimed rights to rule. They begged Edward to arbitrate their dispute, not realizing that the English king saw arbitration as invitation. He appointed himself overlord of Scotland, and in that moment, what had been diplomacy became conquest wrapped in ceremony. Edward's method was always the same. He used law like a weapon and faith like a leash. To him, rebellion wasn't just defiance, it was blasphemy. He demanded that every noble, every knight, swear fealty under oath, binding their souls as well as their swords. And in a world where an oath before God was sacred, breaking it was treason not only against the crown, but against heaven itself. That single concept, treason, would become the noose around William Wallace's neck. Medieval power thrived on ritual. Every kneel, every kiss of the royal hand was theater designed to remind men who owned them. To break an oath was to fracture the divine order. So when Wallace rose years later without ever bending the knee, Edward faced a problem the law couldn't solve. How do you call someone a traitor when he never swore allegiance in the first place? The answer would come in a courtroom built on deceit. But that moment was still years ahead. First, Edward had to make Scotland kneel the way Wales had. He marched north with armies, burned towns, seized castles, and took the legendary Stone of Scone, the symbol of Scottish kingship, to London, placing it beneath his own throne. It was a message written in granite: "You have no crown unless I sit on it." And for a time, fear worked. Scottish nobles saw what happened to the Welsh. Entire villages turned to ash, resistance leaders executed in chains, and they calculated survival. They signed oaths, traded freedom for land, titles, and the illusion of peace. They told themselves they were preserving their people. Edward told himself he was preserving order, but beneath that fragile calm something stirred, a different kind of loyalty, not sworn by lips, but born in fury. Among those who had lost everything to English swords, whispers began about a man who fought without permission, who answered no king but the one he carried in his heart. That man's name would soon echo through forests and taverns: William Wallace. To understand Edward, you must understand the mind of a ruler who built his power on the theater of domination. He wasn't content to win, he needed to be seen winning. Every rebellion was a mirror, showing him that fear could fade, so he learned to weaponize spectacle, public hangings, paraded corpses, heads on bridges. Each act of cruelty was a sermon reminding subjects that mercy belonged only to him. He called it justice. His enemies called it madness. England in 1300 was exhausted but obedient. Taxes fed the endless wars. Cathedrals echoed with prayers for the king's holy campaigns. And yet, in every conquered land, resentment simmered. Wales still smoldered with rebellion. Ireland waited restless. Scotland was next, a kingdom not yet broken, merely bent. Edward knew that a clean conquest wouldn't hold. Only terror could. He intended to rule Scotland not by faith, but by example, and examples, in his world, blood. Meanwhile, Scotland's nobility lived in quiet compromise. Many had pledged to Edward in writing, their signatures preserved like chains. They hunted their own rebels to prove loyalty. They smiled at English banquets, drank English wine, and convinced themselves that submission was strategy. But ordinary Scots saw betrayal in every toast. For them, Wallace became something pure, unbought, unbent, unforgiven, a man who refused to kiss the hand that burned his country. Still, even Wallace needed allies, and alliances in those days were as slippery as blood on iron. In medieval politics, betrayal wasn't a possibility, it was an eventuality. The question was never if someone would sell you out, but when and for how much. Edward understood this better than anyone. He funded spies, bribed abbots, turned kin against kin. Gold and fear did his preaching. Where armies failed, corruption succeeded. Every noble had a price. Every conscience had a measure. And somewhere in Scotland, a man was already calculating the worth of William Wallace's capture. Because history doesn't pivot on armies alone, it turns on whispers. And one whisper, just one, would soon end a rebellion and start a legend. When Wallace struck at Stirling Bridge in 1297, routing an army twice his size, Edward's empire trembled for the first time. But triumph bred isolation. Each victory forced the nobles deeper into English arms. A commoner defeating England made the aristocracy look weak. They would rather serve a foreign king than follow a man without pedigree. So they abandoned him. They made peace with Edward while Wallace hid among the mountains, hunted and alone. And that brings us to the quiet hinge of fate, the betrayal that would trade one man's freedom for another man's fortune. A betrayal so small in its beginning, so ordinary, that no one noticed when it happened. Just a signature, a sealed letter, a nod in the dark. But its echo would roll across centuries, because in 1305, when the English bounty glittered brighter than loyalty, one of Scotland's own stepped forward to collect it. His name was Sir John de Menteith, once a knight of Scotland, now Edward's man. He would become the instrument through which England's greatest execution began. And that is where the story turns. The rebellion isn't over. It's about to be betrayed. The man they hunted will soon be caught. And the hands that bind him will not be English. He was no nobleman, no prince raised on politics or privilege. He was a man born among fields and stone, a common soul who chose defiance over comfort, truth over silence. He wasn't meant to change history, he was meant to live quietly within it. But the world never allows peace to those who can see injustice too clearly. William Wallace came from the lowlands of Elderslie, a region carved by wind, rain, and war. His father, Sir Malcolm Wallace, was of minor nobility, just enough rank to be noticed, but never enough to be safe. When Edward's forces swept across Scotland, they didn't distinguish between rebels and subjects. Villages burned, families scattered, and men like Malcolm were branded as troublemakers for defending their own soil. Wallace grew up watching loyalty punished and obedience rewarded. He saw how power smiled at submission and sneered at dignity. Some say his rebellion began with the killing of an English sheriff. A local dispute turned legend. Others say it began the day his father and brother were executed for refusing to kneel. The truth, like most truths in history, lies somewhere between grief and fury. What is certain is that Wallace rose not for crowns or titles, but because submission had become unbearable. He gathered others, Farmers, blacksmiths, deserters, the unwanted and the unbowed, men who had lost everything except their will to resist. They fought with whatever they had: axes meant for wood, scythes meant for wheat, faith meant for better days. Against an empire, they stood like stones in a flood. The year was 1297, and the English garrisons stationed across Scotland had grown arrogant. They underestimated the hunger of the oppressed. At Stirling, north of the River Forth, an English army of nearly 10,000 men prepared to crush the rebellion once and for all. Their confidence was absolute, their numbers overwhelming. Their leader, the Earl of Surrey, believed the fight would end before noon. But Wallace understood something they did not: terrain, timing, and desperation. He and his commander, Andrew de Moray, chose to make their stand near the narrow wooden bridge at Stirling. It was a simple structure. 2 men could barely ride across side by side. Beneath it, the river churned cold and merciless. The English didn't see the trap because pride makes even the smartest generals blind. As the English cavalry began to cross, Wallace waited. He watched the first ranks advance: heavy horses, armored men, banners flashing in the morning sun. He gave no signal until the bridge groaned under the weight of too many. Then, with one command, the Scots struck. They attacked from the high ground, their spears angled down like a wall of thorns. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. English knights fell into the river, dragged down by their own armor, their screams swallowed by the water. Those who made it across were met with steel and fury. Wallace's men, barefoot and hungry, fought as if they had already died and were now avenging themselves. By noon, the mighty English army was in ruins. The survivors fled south, leaving weapons, banners, and pride behind. The low-born rebel had done the impossible. He had humiliated an empire. News spread faster than any messenger could ride. Across Scotland, peasants whispered his name like a prayer. Songs were sung in taverns and on battlefields, and for the first time, a nation beaten to its knees began to stand. Wallace was no longer a man. He was an idea, proof that courage could embarrass power. But fame, like fire, consumes as much as it lights. With every victory, Wallace gained followers and enemies. The same nobles who had once ignored him now feared him. A commoner commanding armies threatened the delicate balance of hierarchy. In medieval Scotland, birth mattered more than bravery, and Wallace's bloodline was an insult to their titles. When he was named Guardian of Scotland after the victory, it was not a coronation. It was a declaration of war from within. He had the loyalty of soldiers, not the approval of aristocrats. And while the common people worshipped him, the lords whispered about him in candlelit rooms, calling him reckless, dangerous, ungovernable. Still, he never softened. He refused to negotiate peace with Edward. He refused ransom, reward, and compromise. Where others saw survival, he saw surrender. It was said that even when offered truce, he spat the word, mercy, as if it were poison. To Wallace, there could be no peace with a tyrant, only the end of one rule or the end of his breath. There are small legends scattered through his story, pieces of humanity that survived the centuries. Some say he would pray before battle not for victory, but for justice, that he shared his food before eating, that he punished looters who hurt civilians, that he rode into villages alone to calm frightened families, promising them that their suffering had meaning. Whether all of it is true or not no longer matters, because what mattered was what people believed. And they believed that somewhere in the hills, a man still stood unbroken. The English called him an outlaw. The Scots called him their only hope. Every victory he won was written into English law as treason, but into Scottish memory as faith. Yet behind the rising legend, the man himself was growing weary. Leadership had become a burden heavier than armor. Every step forward drew blood. Every ally gained came with a cost. The rebellion he had sparked no longer belonged to him. It belonged to history, and history is never kind to its creators. When Andrew de Moray, his co-leader, fell in battle, Wallace lost the one man who matched both his courage and his conscience. After that, he fought alone, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't trust anyone else. And in that isolation, betrayal began to circle him like vultures waiting for the fall. Even his victories betrayed him. The higher he rose, the smaller the space for safety became. To Edward, he was now not a rebel, but a rival myth. Killing Wallace was no longer about law, it was about legacy. And so the crown began to whisper. Gold passed between hands. Letters sealed in wax crossed borders. The same nobles who toasted his name began to pass information about his movements. The same country he bled for began to bleed him in silence. For every great man history exalts, there comes a moment when the world he saved decides it can live without him. For Wallace, that moment was coming fast. His victories had changed the course of power, but they had also marked his death sentence, because nothing frightens rulers more than a man who proves they can be defeated. And so the hero of Stirling Bridge, the man who rose from ashes and made kings tremble, was now being hunted not by his enemies, but by his own. His life was no longer his own story. It had become a weapon others were eager to use. Victory had made him immortal in legend, but mortal in reality. And soon, that reality would come crashing through the door. Because after triumph comes the reckoning, and for William Wallace, glory was about to become his greatest danger. Victory, for most men, is the end of struggle. For William Wallace, it was the beginning of exile. After the triumph at Stirling Bridge, Scotland should have celebrated freedom. The English had been humiliated, their army crushed, their authority shaken. But power doesn't dissolve after defeat. It shifts shape. While Wallace was still fighting with swords, England was already fighting with strategy. Edward I, humiliated but unbroken, understood that brute force could only do so much. The rebellion had been born from emotion, pride, grief, anger, and emotion could be manipulated. If he couldn't destroy Scotland by invasion, he would divide it from within, and he knew exactly where to strike the nobles. Scotland's aristocracy, bloodied but pragmatic, saw the devastation of war firsthand. Fields burned, trade ruined, taxes drained. They were landowners, merchants, politicians in armor. Their allegiance was never purely patriotic, it was transactional. They served whichever master kept their estates intact. For them, Wallace was no longer a hero. He was a liability. His refusal to negotiate, his moral certainty, his unrelenting defiance of Edward's offers, all of it threatened the delicate peace they were trying to preserve. Every time Wallace won a battle, England tightened its economic chokehold, and every noble lost more gold. To the elite, rebellion had become too expensive. In London, Edward capitalized on that fear. He opened his treasury like a weapon, offering pardons, privileges, and trade rights in exchange for silence. He didn't need to fight Wallace anymore. He needed others to stop fighting with him. Soon, Scotland's rebellion began to fracture not from battle, but from betrayal disguised as diplomacy. The shift was subtle but deadly. Armies no longer clashed on open fields. The war moved to letters, whispers, and bribes. Messengers carried promises instead of swords. Spies carried rumors instead of weapons. And the stories spread faster than any army ever could. The English crown began funding a quiet propaganda campaign. They painted Wallace not as a patriot, but as a dangerous fanatic, a man drunk on power, leading the poor to slaughter while the nobility paid the price. In every town Edward's men visited, they told the same tale. Wallace was the reason you starve. Wallace is why your sons die. Wallace is why peace cannot return. It worked. Loyalty began to bend. Confidence turned to exhaustion. The very people who once whispered his name with reverence now did so with fear. Wallace felt it. The silence after the cheers, the hesitation in allies' voices, the uncertainty in their eyes. Victories once celebrated with songs were now met with questions. He was still fighting, but fewer and fewer men followed. Each defection cut deeper than any sword could. He tried to rally the lords, to remind them that freedom bought with compromise was only slavery by another name. But they had already made their choice. They wanted safety, not glory, and Wallace, who could not bend, became the mirror they avoided. His integrity exposed their cowardice. His courage made their excuses crumble. In Edinburgh and Stirling, nobles gathered to discuss peace terms. Wallace was not invited. In secret, letters were exchanged with Edward's envoys. In private, his name was struck from their alliances. By 1300, Wallace had vanished from the official record, not because he had fallen, but because the powerful had decided to erase him. They wanted the English king to see their loyalty, And what better way to prove it than to silence the man who embarrassed them both? The rebellion's fire dimmed to embers. The guardian of Scotland became an outlaw again. Hunted by the enemy he fought and the friends he protected, Edward's men began offering bounties, gold for information, titles for betrayal, and gold, as history has proven, speaks louder than loyalty. For Wallace, the war was now invisible, fought not on battlefields, but in council halls and candlelit corridors. He could no longer see his enemies. They were seated beside him, smiling. Every knock at the door could be an ally or a traitor. Every meal could be his last. He moved from place to place, never sleeping twice under the same roof, trusting no one but his sword. The land he had freed had become a labyrinth of deceit. The victory that had once made him Scotland's savior now marked him as its most wanted man. The higher he climbed, the clearer it became. Power was not the enemy. Compromise was, and in the end, compromise always wins, until one man refuses to sign. Edward didn't have to capture Wallace himself. All he needed to do was wait for the hunger, the fear, and the greed of men to do it for him. Because loyalty fades, hunger grows, and gold never sleeps. Soon a quiet deal would be struck, a price would be named, and a familiar hand would reach out to take it. When gold begins to speak, even the bravest hearts learn to listen. And in that moment, when the first coin crossed the table, the rebellion truly ended, because when money talks, loyalty dies. And the man who would betray William Wallace was already watching him, waiting for the right night to sell a legend. Betrayal never announces itself. It does not roar, it whispers, and this time it came from within his own walls. By 1305, William Wallace had become a shadow that England could not kill and Scotland could not claim. The nobles who once stood beside him now dined with the very men who hunted him. His rebellion was reduced to movement, always moving, always watching. Every village he entered, every fire he lit, could be the one that gave him away. History tells us that betrayal wears many faces. Some chronicles say it was Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight turned warden under English authority. Others whisper the name Jack Short, the servant who sought revenge for a brother Wallace had slain in war. And some claim it was not a single act, but a web of small betrayals, a door left unbarred, a rumor passed in a tavern, a glance exchanged in the dark. The truth is blurred by time, but the result was the same. Wallace was betrayed not by an army, but by trust. He had been hiding near Glasgow, relying on what little loyalty remained among his countrymen. Menteith offered safety, a night's rest in a guarded house, food, shelter, and silence. To a man hunted for years, the promise of sleep without fear was irresistible. He accepted. The house was quiet, the air heavy, the candles low. Outside, riders waited in the dark. When they came, they did not come with trumpets or war cries. They came like thieves, silent, coordinated, certain. The door burst open, torches flared, and for the first time in years, Wallace saw familiar faces not filled with loyalty, but with hesitation. It is said that he reached for his sword and saw Menteith's crest glinting in the torchlight. That single sight told him everything. He didn't fight, not at first. Some say he surrendered, realizing resistance would only cost innocent lives. Others say he drew his blade, cutting down the first man to touch him before being overpowered. Both versions end the same way: he was bound in chains, dragged into the night, and Scotland's freedom bled quietly into the earth. The capture was not loud. It was deliberate, professional, the kind of operation planned with inside knowledge. They knew where he slept, how many guards he had, even which door would creak. That doesn't happen without conversation or payment. And there was payment. Gold, English gold, delivered to Menteith in return for the man he once called brother. Edward's letters confirm it. The betrayal wasn't just political. It was profitable. When morning came, the villagers found blood in the courtyard and the marks of horses in the mud. They didn't need to ask what had happened. Silence told them everything. The man who had fought for them had been sold by their own. They didn't dare speak his name aloud. To do so was to confess belief, and belief in those days was treason. As Wallace was taken south, shackled and hooded, he must have known that no rescue would come. He had outlived his usefulness to the nobles. To them, His capture was a relief. With Wallace gone, they could make peace and call it honor. With Wallace silenced, they could rebuild their estates and call it loyalty. But for the man himself, the pain wasn't in the chains. It was in the realization that the country he loved had chosen convenience over conscience. That betrayal didn't come from strangers. It came from his own. The English didn't torture him immediately. They didn't need to. The real torture was the journey, the slow humiliation of being paraded through lands he had once freed. He was shown off like a prize, a captured beast meant to reassure a frightened empire that order had returned. Villagers who once sang his name now watched from their windows in silence, afraid to be seen mourning. The rebellion was over, and the price of rebellion rode past them in chains. But Wallace was not broken. Even the English reports, written by men who hated him, admit his composure. He walked with his head high, refusing to speak to his captors. They called him traitor. He answered with silence, a defiance more dangerous than any sword. At night, perhaps, the weight of it sank in, the faces that sold him, the whispers that traded his life for gold. And yet, the chroniclers say he prayed. Not for himself, but for Scotland. Even in captivity, he refused to curse his betrayers. He believed his cause was larger than any man, larger even than betrayal. Still, history is cruel in its honesty. For every legend of loyalty, there is a coin that proves otherwise. Menteith's reward was recorded, his title secured, his betrayal forgotten by those who needed his cooperation. Wallace's reward was iron, and a march to London. The emotional wound of betrayal lasts longer than the physical one, and Wallace's final wound was not inflicted by an English sword, but by Scottish hands. The same land he had defended had delivered him to his death. The chronicles describe that dawn as quiet. A low mist rolled over the fields, the air heavy with rain. As the horses moved, chains clinked softly, a grim lullaby for a man who had once commanded armies. Each mile toward England was another layer of his legend, being stripped away by politics. And yet, something strange happened. As he passed through towns, some peasants knelt, not out of submission, but out of silent mourning. Even bound, he was a symbol too strong to erase. Every road he traveled became a memory etched into stone. His enemies thought they were transporting a prisoner. In truth, they were carrying a martyr to his altar. Because William Wallace had been betrayed by men, but he would be avenged by memory. He was now an English prisoner. But Edward didn't want imprisonment. He wanted a performance, a lesson carved into flesh and fire, and the road to that lesson had only just begun. This was not a punishment. It was an education, a lesson written in flesh, blood, and humiliation, a king's demonstration of how power parades its victories before it kills them. From the moment William Wallace was captured, Edward I understood that his execution had to be more than a death. It had to be a message. Scotland's rebellion had cost him soldiers, money, and pride. Now he wanted repayment in spectacle. He would make the rebels' journey to London an act of theater, one long, public unmaking of a man. The march began in the north under guarded escort. Wallace was bound, iron around his wrists and neck, a chain connecting him to the saddle of an English captain. His body was beaten but upright, his eyes fixed forward. Every village they entered was warned in advance, "Come and see the traitor of England pass." Priests were told to preach obedience, mayors to assemble crowds. The road itself became a stage. In towns like Durham, York, and St. Albans, the pattern repeated. Children were hoisted onto shoulders to glimpse the infamous prisoner. Vendors shouted, selling ale and bread to the spectators as if it were festival day. Women leaned from windows, men jeered and spat, some threw mud, others whispered prayers. For many, this was the first time they had seen the man whose name had terrified the king's army. To the crowd, he was a legend made real and reduced. To Edward, he was a trophy. Every insult shouted was part of the script, rehearsed by fear and rewarded by approval. The public humiliation of Wallace was meant to cleanse the humiliation of England. In medieval England, punishment wasn't just about justice, it was about control. The law served as theater. The more spectacular the pain, the stronger the throne appeared. Kings knew that a terrified population was an obedient one. So executions were performed like plays, with props, audience, and actors who had no choice in their roles. Wallace was to be the lead in Edward's greatest performance, the death of rebellion, live before the eyes of his kingdom. But if this was theater, Wallace refused to play his part. Contemporary accounts speak of his silence. He did not plead, did not shout. He looked at his captors with the calm of a man who had already accepted his fate. His eyes, witnesses said, unnerved even the guards, too steady for a condemned man. There were moments, they say, when a hush fell over the mob as he passed, as though his composure accused them more than his words ever could. At York, a priest tried to bless him, urging him to repent for his sins against the crown. Wallace is said to have replied, "I have done no sin that needs forgiveness, except to fight for my own land." Whether those words were truly his or a chronicler's invention, they became legend. Truth or myth, the meaning was the same. He refused to let Edward define his story. The journey stretched for weeks. The air grew warmer, the crowds larger. In each city, the humiliation deepened. Mock parades, false trials read aloud for the public, trumpets announcing the approach of the traitor. He was forced to wear a mock garland of oak leaves, a cruel parody of the laurel crown given to heroes. And yet, even in chains, he looked more like a leader than the men escorting him. The English soldiers joked that they were guarding a ghost, that nothing human could endure this march without breaking. But Wallace endured. Each mile seemed to burn his defiance deeper into memory. The more they tried to strip him of dignity, the more the idea of him grew. As he neared London, news of his approach reached the city first. Merchants prepared for the spectacle. Chroniclers sharpened their quills. Even nobles arranged to witness his arrival. For Edward's court, this was not the end of a rebellion. It was a celebration of their king's victory. For the poor and the restless, it was something else, a warning, a living demonstration of what happened to those who defied the throne. The final leg of the journey entered the capital through the northern gate. London greeted him with noise, bells, drums, laughter, and curses. The smell of the city mingled with sweat and decay. Wallace was paraded through the crowded streets, the iron collar biting into his skin. The people pressed forward to see him, their faces lit by torchlight. Some pointed, some laughed, but others, the quiet ones, simply stared. In his eyes, they saw something their king could not destroy: composure, even now. The procession wound its way to the Tower, where he was briefly held before his trial. Outside, the city hummed with anticipation. They expected a show. They always did. Edward had turned punishment into performance, rebellion into entertainment. The people had been taught to feast on the pain of others, and in doing so, they forgot their own chains. That was the genius of spectacle. It united rulers and ruled, not through justice, but through fear disguised as ceremony. And as the gates of the Tower closed behind him, the crowd erupted, not knowing that they were cheering for their own submission. Wallace stood there, watching the torches flicker through the bars, the echo of jeers fading into the night. Perhaps, for the first time, he realized what Edward truly wanted. Not just obedience, but belief. He wanted people to believe rebellion was hopeless. But belief, once born, cannot be paraded to death. Even the guards felt it, that uncanny quiet strength that no humiliation could erase. Tomorrow, he would be placed before judges, accused of crimes too vast to defend. But the verdict was already written, the stage already built, the audience already waiting. This march had been the rehearsal. The trial would be the play. And after that, the execution would be the encore. Because the Empire didn't just want him dead. It wanted to watch him die. They held a trial. But a trial only in name. Westminster Hall was not a court that morning. It was a theater disguised as justice. The banners of England hung from every beam, the royal seal stamped on every parchment. The judges wore robes heavy with symbolism and hypocrisy, and the accused was already condemned before he entered the room. William Wallace, bound, bruised, and gaunt from the march, stood beneath the vaulted ceiling where England's laws pretended to breathe. Iron chains clinked against the stone floor as guards forced him to face the tribunal. Around him, the hall was filled not with jurors, but with spectators, nobles, priests, soldiers, and merchants who had come to witness England's triumph. To them, this was not a hearing. It was closure. The empire's final act of revenge wrapped in ceremony. The clerk began to read the charges in Latin, a language meant to exclude the condemned from understanding his own fate. The list was long: treason against the king, murder of royal subjects, sacrilege, destruction of property, rebellion, and the spilling of innocent Christian blood. Each accusation was crafted to sound holy, as if Wallace's rebellion were not against tyranny but against God himself. The irony, of course, was sharp enough to cut stone. Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward I. Under the law, treason could only exist where loyalty had once been pledged, yet Edward's men twisted the definition. They argued that because Scotland was, rightfully, under English rule, all Scots owed obedience to the English crown by birth, not by oath. By that logic, defiance itself was treason. It was a legal trick so elegant in its cruelty that even scholars later called it a masterpiece of manipulation. The law had not been applied to Wallace. It had been rewritten for him. When the charges were finished, the presiding judge, Sir Ralph Sandwich, Edward's loyal official, demanded that Wallace confess and beg mercy. The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. They expected him to kneel. They expected a final submission. Instead, he raised his head. "I cannot be a traitor," he said, voice clear and steady, "to a king I never acknowledged." The words struck like thunder in that hall. For a moment, even the scribes paused. He had dismantled their illusion with a single sentence. They called him traitor, yet their own law exposed their lie. But this was not a place for truth. It was a place for punishment. The judges ignored his statement. They didn't debate it. They didn't dare. Edward's orders were absolute: no argument, no appeal, no delay. The trial was a script, and every actor knew their lines. The prosecutor read from parchment, listing atrocities allegedly committed under Wallace's command: the burning of abbeys, the deaths of women and children, the slaughter of priests. None of it could be proven. Most of it was propaganda recycled from Edward's campaigns. But evidence was irrelevant. Only the appearance of law mattered. Wallace stood silent as his life was rewritten before him. Each lie was greeted with murmurs of agreement, each exaggeration with righteous nods. To the spectators, he wasn't a man. He was a canvas on which the crown painted its victory. One chronicler wrote that Wallace's calm unnerved the judges more than anger ever could. His silence, they said, made their performance feel hollow. And perhaps that was his final act of defiance, refusing to play the role they had assigned him. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't to defend himself. It was to reclaim his dignity. "I fought to defend my people from oppression," he declared. "The deeds they call treason were done against unlawful tyranny. If that is treason, then every free man is guilty." The words were not recorded in full. The scribes deliberately edited them. But they spread anyway. Outside the court, the crowd began to whisper. Some said he had cursed the king. Others said he had forgiven his enemies. The truth was simpler. He had spoken as if judgment were beneath him. The verdict, of course, was predetermined. The Chief Justice announced it without ceremony. Guilty. Wallace was to be taken to the Tower, held overnight, and the next day, drawn, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. Each word was chosen with precision. It was not a sentence. It was choreography. The English crown had engineered a ritual of death designed to teach obedience. But even in that moment, as the judgment was read, he did not lower his gaze. He looked past his accusers, past the spectators, past the hall itself. It is said that when he smiled, one of the guards crossed himself, as if he feared that defiance might be contagious. To the court, his composure was insolence. To history, it was immortality. As the guards dragged him away, his chains rattled against the floor, a grim applause for the Empire's performance. Behind him, the hall erupted into the dull murmur of satisfaction. The nobles discussed dinner plans, the clerks filed papers, the judges removed their robes as if they had simply finished another day's work. For Edward, this was victory. Rebellion had been tried, condemned, and recorded. The world would read of Wallace's guilt and England's justice. But history remembers differently. History remembers that the law itself was executed that day, not the man. Outside the hall, London buzzed with expectation. The sentence was already being announced in taverns and markets. Crowds gathered near Smithfield, eager for the grand finale. Executions were entertainment, and this one promised to outshine them all. In the Tower, Wallace waited. His body was weakened, his hands raw from iron, but his mind remained unbroken. Chroniclers claim he prayed through the night, not for rescue, that illusion had long passed, but for meaning, for his death to matter, for it to awaken those who still slept under the illusion of peace. He must have known that Edward's purpose was not simply to end him, but to erase him, to turn him into a warning, not a memory. But what kings never learn, what empires always forget, is that spectacle does not destroy belief, it feeds it. And as dawn approached, and the guards came for him, the man they thought they were about to silence had already become louder than their words could contain. Because tomorrow's execution would not be justice. It would be a message carved into history's skin, and what they sentenced today, engineered to terrify, would become the very act that made him eternal. This was not merely a death, it was a message, written in blood, proclaimed by fear, and designed to echo for centuries. Smithfield, London, a field that had seen tournaments and fairs now prepared for the crown's most spectacular lesson. Vendors rolled in before sunrise, carts creaking under barrels of ale and baskets of bread. Children climbed posts for a better view. The wealthy arrived early, purchasing space on wooden galleries built for the occasion. Every class of London stood shoulder to shoulder, united by curiosity. The air itself seemed staged. Flags, smoke, the smell of iron and sweat. Edward's officers moved through the crowd, ensuring order, reminding all that this was not an execution, but a demonstration. A sermon about power, delivered through a single man. The drawing before the crowd even saw him. They heard the sound, the groan of wheels and the scrape of rope against wood. Wallace was brought from the Tower, tied to a hurdle, a rough wooden frame dragged by horses through the streets. His body struck the stones as the procession advanced, every jolt a reminder of what rebellion costs. People leaned from windows, throwing handfuls of dust, shouting curses rehearsed by propaganda. Yet between the insults, there were pauses, moments of uncertain silence. They had been told he was a monster. What they saw was a man. He was stripped of armor, of weapon, of voice, but not of will. His gaze stayed forward, fixed on something beyond the crowd. Some said he whispered a prayer. Others said his lips moved without sound, as if speaking to someone history would never name. The humiliation was deliberate. Edward wanted every street to witness what happens when a subject forgets obedience. He wanted mothers to pull their children close, soldiers to straighten their backs, priests to thank God for order. The road itself became the first stage of the performance. The hanging when the hurdle reached Smithfield, the noise swelled. Bells rang, drums thundered, and the people pressed forward. In the center of the square stood the wooden frame, tall, crude, merciless. Wallace was lifted, bound, and suspended. The crowd fell quiet. The executioner pulled the rope, slowly, deliberately. There was no quick break. This was strangulation, not mercy. The purpose was not death, but duration. The longer he endured, the longer the king's authority seemed absolute. And yet, witnesses later wrote that the rebel did not plead. His silence unnerved them. The only movement came from the tightening of his hands, the faint rise of his chest as he fought for air. He endured until the world blurred. Then the rope was cut, and he fell, half conscious, half alive, because Edward wanted the lesson to continue. The soldiers lifted him onto a platform, the crowd again roaring its approval, half fear, half fascination. Children cheered. The nobles watched without expression. The churchmen muttered prayers that sounded more political than holy. Stop. Picture this. A nation watching its own morality on trial. Ask yourself, when punishment becomes performance, who truly stands condemned? The burning of the body, the next act began in ritual precision. Fires were lit, incense and smoke mingled until the air itself seemed to choke. What followed was not a display of justice, but of domination. The body turned into a symbol. The chroniclers describe how parts of him were shown to the crowd, offered as proof that rebellion has no heart left to beat. They called it purification. In truth, it was desecration sanctified by ceremony. They burned his insides not to end him, but to burn the idea he represented. The executioners held high what remained, shouting oaths of loyalty to the crown. The crowd responded with uneasy cheers. For a heartbeat, London looked away from the spectacle, sensing that something larger than a man was being destroyed. The smell of smoke, the ringing of bells, the roar of thousands, it became one great noise that drowned out conscience. Yet somewhere within that chaos, the seed of myth took root. Every attempt to erase him only deepened his impression on memory. The beheading and the quartering, when the ordeal was finally declared complete, a clean blade ended what cruelty had begun. The executioner lifted the head high, shouting the name of the king and the crime of treason. But there was a stillness, a hesitation in the cheers. The audience had come for satisfaction and left with something colder, the uncomfortable feeling that they had witnessed faith destroyed by fear. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it, then carried through the city streets in triumph. It was placed atop London Bridge, facing north, toward the land he had tried to free. Below, the river carried its reflection away. The rest of his remains were divided according to royal decree, each quarter sent to a different Scottish stronghold: Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling, cities chosen not for reverence, but for warning. Each was displayed at the gate as a monument to obedience. Each, over time, became a shrine. They meant to turn a man into a lesson. Instead, they turned a lesson into a story. The message was meant to frighten Scotland into silence. Instead, it gave Scotland a relic. The places that displayed his remains became places where people whispered prayers, sang forbidden songs, and remembered courage. The fragments of his body became the fragments of a nation's identity. The crowd and the quiet when the execution was over. The crowd dispersed in uneasy silence. The smell of ash lingered. The vendors packed up their stalls. Children stopped cheering. Even the guards seemed subdued. They had expected triumph and found discomfort. Some chroniclers noted that the sky darkened that afternoon, clouds rolling in from the north. Superstition or coincidence, the people took it as a sign. The king's message had reached heaven, and heaven was displeased. Back in Westminster, the judges reported success. The rebellion, they claimed, was over, the king's order restored. But across the border, word traveled differently. Messengers and merchants carried the tale, not of a traitor destroyed, but of a hero defying death itself. By the time the winter winds reached Scotland, Wallace's death had already become scripture. Mothers told their children how a man stood against a king and would not kneel. Soldiers carried tokens engraved with his initials. Priests whispered his name in prayer, even while denying it aloud. Stop again. Picture this: an empire convinced it has silenced rebellion while, in truth, it has given rebellion a voice that will never age. The meaning what Edward achieved that day was not control, it was martyrdom. He had wanted a corpse to frighten the living. What he created was an idea that refused to die. Wallace's death became the moral mirror of the age. Every act of cruelty reflected the weakness of the powerful. His body was gone, but his defiance remained, carried in rumor, in memory, in the hush that fell whenever his name was spoken. They believed they were killing rebellion. They were teaching it to generations unborn. And in the years that followed, when Scotland rose again under Robert the Bruce, men would ride into battle shouting the very name the crown had tried to erase. What Edward wanted, silence, instead set a match to an entire people. When the smoke of Smithfield faded and London returned to its routines, the English crown believed the rebellion was finally over. The banners of victory still fluttered from castle walls, and official messengers carried the royal proclamation: William Wallace, traitor and outlaw, is dead. Scotland is pacified. But the truth moved faster than parchment. Long before the king's messengers reached the border, word of the execution had already crossed it, not in documents, but in whispers. Merchants, travelers, and priests spoke of what they had seen, how the man they called traitor had faced death without bowing his head, how the crowd had fallen silent, how even in pieces, His defiance seemed to breathe. By the time the story reached Scotland, it had already changed shape. The English described a punishment. The Scots heard a prophecy. In the villages and glens, people gathered in secret to repeat the tale, each time adding something new. A phrase, a prayer, a vow. The more the English tried to bury the truth, the more vivid it became. In the markets of Perth, old women wept aloud. In the taverns of Fife, men raised their cups to his name. And in the churches, where loyalty to the crown was law, the priests read psalms that spoke of martyrs who suffered for the righteous cause. They did not name him, but everyone understood. The English administration was slow to see what had happened. They had created a myth far stronger than any army. They believed the spectacle of punishment would erase rebellion. Instead, it gave rebellion a body to worship. The quartered remains of Wallace were supposed to serve as warnings, displayed at the gates of 4 cities. Yet in every town where a fragment was hung, people began to treat it as relic, not deterrent. Mothers would cross themselves when passing beneath it. Travelers would leave flowers or coins at the base of the walls. Soldiers assigned to guard the gates reported finding candles burning there at night. Fear had not returned. Faith had. The legend grew in rhythm with the silence of those who tried to suppress it. Songs began to spread, soft at first, then louder. They told of the man who would not kneel, the warrior who spoke truth to kings. English soldiers who tried to arrest the singers found that the verses had already traveled to the next village. The propaganda meant to unify the empire instead fractured it, a dangerous irony that no decree could contain. Edward I realized his mistake too late. Reports reached him that rebellion was stirring again in the north, not in armies but in spirit. His own officers wrote that. The people murmur still of the man Wallace, as though he lives. The king raged. He ordered fresh campaigns, harsher laws, more hangings. Yet each measure only strengthened the story. He had crucified a man's body and found that the soul cannot be quartered. In Scotland, the nobles who once mocked Wallace now found his ghost haunting them. They had chosen survival over resistance, and now survival felt like shame. None felt it more than Robert the Bruce. He had once fought under Edward, seeking advantage, calculating his moment. But the sight of Wallace's death, and the courage that outlived it, shook him. Chroniclers would later argue that Bruce's rebellion began the day Wallace's head was raised on London Bridge. Whether true or not, Wallace's execution planted a seed in Bruce's heart, the understanding that compromise with tyranny could never buy peace, only delay slavery. Bruce began to move quietly, building alliances, gathering support. He studied the mistakes of both Wallace and Edward, Wallace's refusal to bend, Edward's obsession with control. He realized that freedom would not come from a single battle, but from persistence, from making rebellion a way of life rather than a moment of rage. In this sense, Wallace's death was not an ending but a blueprint. The English chroniclers wrote of a restored order. The Scottish ballads wrote of an unfinished promise. 2 histories diverged from the same event, one official, one eternal, and history, as it always does, sided with the version that survived in the hearts of the people. There were other signs that Edward's triumph was hollow. In London, guards reported pilgrims traveling south, quietly visiting the bridge where Wallace's head was mounted. They claimed to be merchants or wanderers, but many came only to look upward, to see the blackened face staring north toward home. Some whispered prayers. Some left tokens, sprigs of hither, small carved crosses. Within a year, London officials ordered the guards to chase them away. The king's warning had become a shrine. The English court called it treasonous superstition. The Scots called it memory. And memory, once sanctified by injustice, cannot be erased. Edward's health began to fail not long after. The iron will that had conquered kingdoms was corroded by paranoia and pain. He saw rebellion in every shadow, disloyalty in every council. He ordered new fortresses built, new taxes raised, new campaigns planned. But the fire that had once made him relentless now only made him desperate. He dreamed of Wallace. Some said that the ghost of the rebel came to him at night, standing silent at the foot of his bed. The king's clerks dismissed the tale, but it traveled through the halls of England like a curse. By the time Edward died in 1307, he was still planning his next invasion of Scotland. His body was carried north, as if even in death he meant to finish what Wallace had defied. But he never crossed the border again. The war he started would outlive him, and so would the man he had killed to end it. Scotland rose once more, this time under Bruce. It was a different kind of war, less about vengeance, more about endurance. Yet behind every rallying cry, behind every sword raised, there lingered the same unspoken memory. A man chained in Smithfield, eyes lifted to the sky, dying without bending his knee. The English had meant his execution to erase rebellion. Instead, it gave rebellion a saint. Every law Edward wrote, every tax he raised, every castle he built, all of it trembled beneath the weight of that single image. The more they tried to stamp him out of history, the more immortal he became, because power can kill a man, but not the reason he lived. And the reason Wallace lived, freedom, dignity, truth, had now found new guardians. They no longer needed him alive to fight. His absence was presence enough. Edward died still obsessed. But the dying man he made immortal would be the seed of a nation. They thought they had killed him. They thought they had dragged his body through the mud, burned it to ash, and scattered his name to the wind. But stories travel faster than armies, and memories endure longer than empires. In the years following Wallace's death, Scotland lived in whispers. Public speech was dangerous, rebellion forbidden, but the silence between words grew rich with defiance. Farmers hummed tunes at dusk that soldiers didn't recognize, fragments of songs that told of a man who would not kneel. Shepherds sang them to their flocks on the hills. Sailors murmured them over the roar of the sea. The English could patrol the roads, search the houses, burn the banners, but they could not police a melody. The songs spread like wind, crossing borders no army could guard. Each retelling reshaped the man into something greater. In the villages, Wallace became the avenger of the poor. In the courts of scholars, the symbol of sovereignty. In the hearts of children, the proof that courage could outlive flesh. Every generation added to him what it needed most: faith, fury, hope. The legend grew not because people forgot the truth, but because they needed a truth bigger than history. By the 15th century, the rebel had already become a saint of memory. Blind Harry, the wandering minstrel, gave his ghost a voice that would last centuries. His poem The Wallace, part history, part myth, turned the outlaw into the perfect hero, fearless, noble, divinely guided. It was not factual, it was faithful. Harry's verses transformed the execution scaffold into a throne, the rebel into a prophet. To medieval ears, the details mattered less than the meaning. They didn't need accuracy, they needed endurance. From there, the myth traveled through ink and time. It crossed into the Reformation, when Scotland once again sought freedom, this time from spiritual rule. Preachers invoked Wallace as the man who defied false authority. In the Enlightenment, philosophers called him the embodiment of natural rights, a man who fought not for crown or church, but for the principle that no one was born to bow. Each era claimed him, reshaping his defiance to fit its own struggle. And across the centuries, a pattern emerged. Whenever Scotland's voice was threatened, Wallace's name returned like a heartbeat. During wars, he was invoked as a guardian; in peace, as a reminder of what peace should cost. His figure appeared on banners, statues, and later, in books that turned history into inspiration. What the English crown intended as humiliation became iconography. The tarred head on London Bridge was meant to rot into nothing. Instead, it became an eternal symbol, recreated in art, in song, in the national imagination. Even the law that condemned him did not escape his shadow. Scholars and jurists began to cite his trial as an example of the abuse of power, a moment when the machinery of justice had been used to crush justice itself. Over time, thinkers drew lines from Wallace's fate to the principles that would one day form the backbone of modern law: the right to fair trial, the right to self-determination, the idea that allegiance cannot be coerced. His story became evidence that cruelty disguised as order always collapses under its own weight. Centuries later, reformers studying the history of punishment would quote his case as a turning point, the proof that spectacle breeds resistance. that even the most brutal display cannot make people love their oppressor. In that way, Wallace's execution reshaped not only Scotland's identity, but humanity's conscience. His death was a wound that forced civilization to ask what it meant to be civilized. In art and literature, the myth evolved again. Poets painted him in words, painters cast him in light, and every artist who touched his name added another layer of immortality. By the 19th century, when nationalism stirred anew, Wallace returned as the face of independence. His image appeared in pamphlets, songs, and political rallies, a banner under which the powerless could march. To the modern world, he stood not just for a country, but for an idea that dignity is not granted by power, it is claimed by conscience. And so, across time, the rebel who died in chains continued to speak, in the language of liberty. His courage became the foundation upon which Scotland's sense of self was rebuilt. His defiance became part of every movement that rose against tyranny. The king who ordered his death achieved only this: he ensured that Wallace would never die quietly. Because myths are not lies, they are truths refined by memory. They are the bones of history polished by faith. Even now, 7 centuries later, his shadow stretches across the Highlands. The wind through the ruins of Stirling carries echoes of his vow. His monument stands not as a tomb, but as testimony, proof that conviction can outlast conquest. They thought they were erasing him. Instead, they gave future generations a mirror. They burned him. They tarred him. They scattered his body across 4 corners of the kingdom, thinking they were scattering fear. But history has a strange appetite. It devours cruelty and spits out meaning. Every act meant to erase him only made him more visible. Every punishment meant to break his memory became the fuel that carried it farther. William Wallace's story is not about swords or kings. It is about what happens when one man refuses to kneel, even when the world demands it. His courage was not loud. It was steady, the kind that endures torture, humiliation, and death, yet still refuses surrender. They could silence his voice, but not the reason he spoke. And if you think this story belongs to the 13th century, look closer. The methods change, the message does not. Even today, powers across the world still use spectacle to crush dissent, still believe that by making an example, they can kill an idea. But every generation proves them wrong. Every act of injustice births its own witness. Every silenced truth finds another mouth to speak. History's greatest irony is this: the men who burn the rebels always end up lighting their own pyres. Wallace's death reminds us that resistance does not end with a body. It begins there. His ashes became air, and the air became voice, and the voice became a nation. Some prices are paid so others can breathe free, and freedom once inhaled never leaves the blood. If this story moved you, if it made you feel anger, pride, or even silence, share it. Let more people know how power tried to erase a man and instead carved his name into time. Tell me in the comments which moment struck you the most: the betrayal, the trial, or the execution. Your voice continues the story. And if you want to see the next part, a deep dive into the original chronicles, trial documents, and letters that proved how the legend began, like, share, and subscribe, because some stories are too powerful to stay buried.